I'm an electrical engineer who spent 15 years troubleshooting power grids across the Midwest. I deal in facts, data, and logical explanations. But what happened to me during the blackout of February 14, 2023, in the small town of Milbrook, Illinois, has shaken that foundation to its core. I still wake up some nights, drenched in sweat, remembering the sound of those footsteps in the dark. Let me start from the beginning, because the details matter. Every single one of them. The assignment. Commonwealth Edison had sent me to Milbrook to investigate a series of power fluctuations that had been plaguing the town for weeks. The reports were strange, lights dimming and brightening in perfect synchronization across entire neighborhoods, appliances turning on and off by themselves, and most peculiar of all, several residents claiming their digital clocks were running backward during these episodes. Milbrook is one of those forgotten Illinois towns that time seems to have passed by. Population 2,847 according to the faded sign at the town limits, though I suspect that number was optimistic even when it was painted 20 years ago. The kind of place where everyone knows everyone, where the diner serves the same meatloaf special every Tuesday, and where the biggest excitement is usually the high school football team's performance. I arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in February, driving through a landscape of barren cornfields and skeletal trees under a gray sky that seemed to press down on the earth like a heavy blanket. The temperature was hovering around 15 degrees, and the weather service was predicting a brutal cold front to move through that evening. My first stop was the local power substation on Oak Street, a modest facility that looked like it had been built in the 1960s and maintained with more hope than actual investment. The station supervisor, a grizzled man named Frank Kowalski, met me at the gate with a thermos of coffee and a worried expression. "You're the ComEd guy?" he asked, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "That's right. Dave Morrison." I showed him my ID. "I'm here about the power fluctuations." Frank nodded grimly. "Been happening for 3 weeks now. Started right after we installed those new smart meters on Elm Street. Though I'll be damned if I can figure out the connection." He led me through the facility, pointing out the various components, transformers, switches, protective relays, all of which appeared to be functioning normally. The control room was cramped but organized, with banks of monitors displaying real-time data from across the grid. "Show me what happens during these episodes," I said, pulling out my laptop to interface with their systems. Frank pulled up a chair beside me and began scrolling through the historical data. "Look at this," he said, pointing to a series of readings from the previous Friday. "Everything's normal until 8:47 p.m., then." He paused, letting the data speak for itself. The readings were bizarre. Power consumption had spiked dramatically across the entire town for exactly 3 minutes and 17 seconds, then dropped to almost nothing for the same duration, before returning to normal. But the pattern wasn't random, it was too regular, too precise. Almost like a heartbeat. "Has anyone been able to correlate this with what residents are experiencing?" I asked. Frank's expression darkened. "That's the thing. We've had dozens of calls each time it happens. People saying their lights are flashing in patterns, their phones are picking up strange signals, their TVs are showing channels that don't exist. But the really weird part?" He leaned closer. "It's always the same houses. Always the same streets. Like whatever's causing this is targeted." I spent the rest of the afternoon analyzing the data, walking the affected neighborhoods, and interviewing residents. The stories were consistent in their inconsistency, everyone experienced something different, but the timing was always precise, and the feeling was always the same, a deep, inexplicable dread that seemed to emanate from the very walls of their homes. Mrs. Henderson on Maple Street told me her television had displayed an empty room for exactly 3 minutes and 17 seconds during the last episode. "Not static," she clarified, "but an actual room. Dark, with old wallpaper and a rocking chair in the corner. I could swear I saw the chair moving slightly, like someone had just gotten up from it." Tom Bradley, who lived 2 blocks away, described his digital alarm clock running backward while emitting a low humming sound that seemed to come from inside the walls. "It wasn't just the display," he insisted. "The actual time was going backward. I watched it count down from 8:50 to 8:47, and when it hit 8:47, everything stopped." By evening, I had filled a notebook with similar accounts, each more unsettling than the last. The technical readings suggested a massive, coordinated drain on the electrical system, but the source remained elusive. I decided to spend the night monitoring the substation directly, hoping to catch the phenomenon in real time. The storm. The weather service had been right about the cold front. By 9 p.m., the temperature had dropped to 5 below zero, and the wind was howling across the empty fields with a ferocity that made the power lines sing. I was alone in the control room, surrounded by the quiet hum of electrical equipment and the occasional pop of the space heater Frank had left for me. I had set up my monitoring equipment to record everything: voltage fluctuations, frequency changes, harmonic distortions, and electromagnetic interference. If something was manipulating the power grid, I was going to catch it. At 10:15 p.m., I noticed the first anomaly. Nothing dramatic, just a slight increase in the electromagnetic field readings from the northern part of town. The same area where most of the strange incidents had been reported. I made a note and continued monitoring. The wind outside was getting worse, rattling the windows of the control room and causing the overhead lights to flicker occasionally. I remember thinking that if we lost power during one of these episodes, it would be nearly impossible to determine what was natural and what was something else. At 10:43 p.m., my phone rang. It was Frank, calling from his house 3 miles away. "Dave, you need to get out of there," he said, his voice tight with concern. "The storm's getting worse, and I just heard on the radio that power lines are down all over the county. If that substation loses its connection to the main grid." "I'll be fine," I told him. "I've got backup power, and I need to be here in case something happens." There was a pause. "Something is happening, Dave. My neighbors are calling me. The lights are starting to flicker in that pattern again. And it's not even 8:47 yet." I looked at my monitors. The electromagnetic readings were climbing steadily, but there was no corresponding change in power consumption. It was as if the entire electrical system was being influenced by something outside of it, something that wasn't drawing power but was somehow affecting the flow of electricity itself. "Frank, I need you to stay on the line," I said. "Tell me exactly what you're seeing." "The street lights are pulsing in sequence, from north to south. It's like a wave moving through the neighborhood." "And Dave?" "The snow is falling upward." I looked out the window. The snow was indeed falling upward, or rather, it was being pulled upward by some invisible force, creating swirling columns that danced between the power lines like ghostly tornadoes. "I'm recording everything," I told him. "Whatever this is, we're going to figure it out." That's when the lights went out. The darkness. The power failure wasn't like anything I'd experienced before. Usually, when a substation loses power, there's a sequence of events: protective relays trip, backup systems engage, warning lights flash. This was different. Everything simply stopped. The hum of the transformers, the whir of the cooling fans, the soft electronic beeping of the monitoring equipment, all of it ceased in perfect unison, as if someone had thrown a master switch for the entire world. My phone was dead. Not just the call with Frank, but the device itself. The screen wouldn't respond, and the battery indicator had vanished. I fumbled in my bag for my flashlight, but when I pressed the button, nothing happened. The LED emergency lighting that should have activated automatically remained dark. I sat in the absolute darkness of the control room, trying to process what was happening. This wasn't a simple power outage. Something was interfering with all electrical devices, including battery-powered ones. The only sound was the wind outside and my own breathing, which seemed unnaturally loud in the silence. Then I heard the footsteps. They were coming from somewhere above me, in the ceiling space between the control room and the roof. Slow, deliberate steps that moved from east to west, paused, then returned. The rhythm was wrong for a person walking normally, too measured, too precise. Each step landed with exactly the same weight, exactly the same timing. I knew the building layout. There was no floor above the control room, just a narrow crawlspace for cable runs and ventilation. No one could be walking up there, and even if they could, how would they have gotten in? The building was locked, and I had the only key. The footsteps stopped directly above my chair. I don't know how long I sat there, frozen in the darkness, waiting for something to happen. It could have been minutes or hours. Without any working timepieces, my sense of time became completely distorted. But gradually, I became aware of a faint light seeping through the windows, not the warm yellow of electrical lighting, but a cold, blue, white glow that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I made my way to the window and looked out at the town below. Every house, every building, every street was bathed in that same ethereal light. It wasn't coming from the streetlights or windows, those were all dark. The light seemed to be emanating from the very air itself, as if the atmosphere had become luminescent. And in that ghostly illumination, I could see them. The figures. There were people in the streets. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds. They stood motionless in the intersections, on the sidewalks, in the yards of the houses. From my vantage point in the substation, they looked like statues, perfectly still, all facing the same direction. North, toward the old part of town where the original settlement had been built in the 1800s. I pressed my face against the cold glass, trying to make out details. The figures were dressed in what looked like period clothing, long coats, old, fashioned hats, dresses that reached the ground. They stood in perfect rows, like soldiers in formation, but there was something wrong with their posture. They were too straight, too rigid. No living person stands that still. The footsteps above me resumed, moving in the same east-west pattern. But now I could hear something else, a low humming sound that seemed to come from the ground itself. It was barely audible, felt more than heard, like the rumble of a distant freight train. But it was growing stronger. I tried to rationalize what I was seeing. Mass hallucination brought on by stress and lack of oxygen? Some kind of natural phenomenon that could explain both the power failure and the strange light? But even as I ran through the possibilities, I knew I was grasping at straws. This was beyond anything in my experience, beyond anything in my training. The figures in the street began to move. It wasn't walking in any normal sense. They glided forward without any visible movement of their legs, maintaining their rigid posture as they progressed toward the north end of town. The movement was perfectly synchronized, every figure advancing at exactly the same speed, maintaining exactly the same distance from their neighbors. I watched in fascination and growing horror as this impossible parade filed through the streets below. There had to be 300 or 400 of them, all moving with that same eerie precision. As they passed under the streetlights, I could see that some of them were translucent, their forms flickering like bad television reception. The humming grew louder, and I realized it was coming from the figures themselves. Not from their mouths, they showed no sign of breathing or speaking, but from their very presence. The sound of their existence, if that makes any sense. That's when I noticed the children. Mixed in with the adult figures were smaller forms, children of various ages, dressed in the same old-fashioned clothing. But unlike the adults, who maintained their rigid posture, the children kept turning their heads to look up at the windows of the buildings they passed. Their faces were pale in the blue-white light, and their eyes were black. Not dark brown or deep blue, but absolutely black, like holes cut in their faces. And every single one of them was looking directly at me. I stumbled backward from the window, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The rational part of my mind was screaming that this couldn't be real, that I was having some kind of breakdown. But the evidence of my senses was undeniable. Something impossible was happening in the town of Milbrook, and I was witnessing it from the front row. The footsteps above me stopped. In the silence that followed, I became aware of a new sound, a soft tapping, like fingernails on glass. It was coming from the window I had just backed away from. Tap, tap, tap. Pause. Tap, tap, tap. I forced myself to look. One of the children was standing just outside the window, floating 3 feet off the ground. It was a girl, maybe 8 or 9 years old, wearing a white dress that seemed to glow with its own internal light. Her black eyes were fixed on mine, and she was tapping on the glass with one pale finger. Tap, tap, tap. Behind her, the procession of figures continued its march toward the north end of town, but she remained at the window, tapping and staring. Her mouth was moving, but I couldn't hear what she was saying through the glass. I stood frozen, unable to move toward the window or away from it. The girl's expression was not malevolent, exactly, more like curious, or perhaps lonely. She tilted her head to one side, studying me with those impossible black eyes. Then she pressed her entire hand against the glass. The window began to frost over from the inside, ice crystals spreading outward from the point where her palm touched. The temperature in the room dropped so quickly that I could see my breath, and the moisture in the air began to condense into tiny droplets that hung suspended like a miniature galaxy. The girl's mouth moved again, and this time I could hear her, though her voice seemed to come from inside my own head rather than through my ears. "He's coming back." The presence. The girl at the window faded away like smoke, leaving only the frost pattern on the glass as evidence she had ever been there. But her words echoed in my mind with a clarity that was more frightening than her appearance had been. "He's coming back." Who was coming back? And why was I suddenly certain that I didn't want to find out? The procession of figures had reached the north end of town and was disappearing into the old cemetery that sat on a hill overlooking the original settlement. I could see them filing through the rusted iron gates, their forms becoming more translucent as they moved among the weathered headstones. Within minutes, they had all vanished, leaving the streets empty and silent once again. But the blue-white light remained, and the humming sound was now coming from the direction of the cemetery. It had changed pitch, becoming deeper and more resonant, like the sound of a massive pipe organ played at the very bottom of its range. I tried to think through my options rationally. My car was in the parking lot outside, but without working electronics, it was unlikely to start. The nearest house was half a mile away, and I had no idea if the residents were even still there or if they had joined the ghostly parade I had just witnessed. The smart thing to do was to stay put and wait for dawn. Whatever was happening seemed to be tied to the darkness, and sunrise was only a few hours away. I could barricade myself in the control room and wait it out. That plan lasted about 30 seconds. The humming stopped abruptly, and in the silence that followed, I heard a new sound, the scrape of metal against metal, coming from somewhere in the building. It was rhythmic, like someone dragging a chain across a concrete floor. The sound grew louder, and I realized it was coming from the main corridor that connected the control room to the rest of the facility. I grabbed a wrench from the toolkit and moved to the door. The scraping sound was definitely in the hallway now, moving slowly toward the control room. But that was impossible. I had locked the main entrance when I arrived, and the building had no other access points. The scraping stopped directly outside the door. I pressed my ear against the cold metal and listened. Nothing. No breathing, no footsteps, no indication that anyone was there. But I could feel a presence on the other side of the door, something that radiated cold and hunger and ancient malevolence. The door handle began to turn. I watched in horror as the handle rotated slowly, deliberately, until it reached the fully open position. The door itself remained closed. I had thrown the deadbolt, but the handle had turned as if someone were testing it from the outside. Then came the knocking. It wasn't the polite tap of someone asking for entry. This was a thunderous pounding that shook the entire door frame and sent vibrations through the floor. Boom. 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 Each impact was like a sledgehammer blow, and I could see the metal door actually bending inward with each strike. Between the blows, I heard a voice, deep, resonant, and filled with such overwhelming authority that it seemed to bypass my ears entirely and speak directly to my bones. "Open the door, David Morrison." It knew my name. Somehow, whatever was out there knew exactly who I was. "Open the door, and I will make it quick." I pressed my back against the far wall, wrench clutched in my trembling hands. The pounding continued, and with each blow, the door bent a little more. The deadbolt was holding, but the frame itself was beginning to crack. "You have seen what you should not have seen. You have heard what you should not have heard. But I am merciful. Open the door, and your death will be painless." The voice was getting closer, as if the speaker were somehow passing through the door without opening it. I could feel the temperature dropping again, and my breath was coming in short, painful gasps. "I have walked these streets for 147 years, David Morrison. I have watched this town grow and change, and I have taken those who intrude upon my domain. You are not the first to witness the gathering. You will not be the last." The pounding stopped. In the sudden silence, I could hear only my own ragged breathing and the wild hammering of my heart. "But perhaps," the voice continued, now seeming to come from directly behind me, "you would prefer to join them willingly." I spun around, wrench raised, but the room was empty. The voice was now coming from all directions at once, surrounding me like a physical presence. "The offer is generous, David Morrison. Join the gathering, and you will never know fear again. Never know loneliness. Never know the pain of existence in this cold, indifferent world. The blue-white light outside the windows began to pulse in rhythm with the voice, and I realized that the entire town was somehow connected to whatever was speaking to me. The power fluctuations, the strange incidents, the coordinated electrical disturbances, they were all manifestations of this presence, this thing that had been using the electrical grid as a conduit for its influence. "You understand now," the voice said, and I could hear satisfaction in its tone. "You see the truth. I am the current that flows through every wire, the spark that gives life to every circuit. I am electricity itself, ancient and eternal, and this town is my body." The lights in the control room flickered to life, not the normal fluorescence, but a harsh, blue-white glare that hurt to look at. Every piece of equipment began to activate at once, monitors displaying impossible readings, alarms blaring in harmonious discord. "Look at your instruments, David Morrison. See what you have stumbled into." I forced myself to look at the monitors, though every instinct screamed at me to run. The readings were beyond anything I had ever seen, voltage levels that should have destroyed every device in the building, frequency variations that violated the fundamental laws of physics, electromagnetic fields strong enough to stop a human heart. But in the chaos of numbers and graphs, I began to see a pattern. The fluctuations weren't random, they were forming shapes, symbols, almost like a language written in electrical impulses. And as I watched, the symbols began to resolve into something recognizable. Names. Hundreds of names, scrolling across the screens in that same blue-white light. And at the bottom of each screen, a date, February 14, 1876. "The night I died," the voice said, and now I could hear sadness beneath the menace. "The night the townspeople thought they had destroyed me. They found my laboratory, my experiments with electromagnetic force, my attempts to transcend the limitations of mortal flesh. They called me a warlock, a heretic, a danger to their simple, God-fearing community." The names on the screens were getting longer, more detailed. Not just names, but brief descriptions. Thomas Hartwell, age 34, blacksmith. Died February 14, 1876. Cause, electrocution. Margaret Sims, age 28, seamstress. Died February 14, 1876. Cause, cardiac arrest. "I showed them the true power of electricity," the voice continued. "I demonstrated that death was merely another state of existence, that consciousness could be preserved in the electromagnetic field itself. They responded with torches and pitchforks, as ignorant mobs always do." The screens now showed hundreds of names, all with the same date of death. The entire population of Milbrook in 1876, killed in a single night. But I had prepared for their treachery. My final experiment, the one they interrupted, was designed to transfer my consciousness into the very electrical field of the town itself. They thought they had killed me, but they had only freed me from the limitations of flesh. I was beginning to understand. The presence I was talking to wasn't just some malevolent spirit, it was Dr. Silas Blackwood, the town's original physician and scientist, who had been experimenting with electricity decades before Edison made it commercially viable. The historical records I had read mentioned him briefly, a brilliant but eccentric man who had died in a laboratory fire in 1876. Except he hadn't died. He had become something else. "Every few years, I gather them," the voice said. "The townspeople who watched me burn. I call them from their graves, and they walk the streets once more, remembering the night they thought they had won. It is their penance, and my revenge." "But why now?" I managed to ask. "Why tonight?" "Because tonight marks the 147th anniversary of my transformation. And because the new electrical systems you have installed have given me more power than I have ever possessed. The smart meters, the digital infrastructure, the wireless communications, they are all conduits for my consciousness. I am no longer confined to this single town, David Morrison. I am spreading." The monitors now showed electrical grids across the entire Midwest, all connected by the same blue-white pulse that had infected Milbrook. Chicago, Milwaukee, Indianapolis, St. Louis, major cities where the same impossible readings were beginning to appear. "You have given me the keys to the kingdom," the voice said, and I could hear triumph in its tone. "Every electrical device in the country will soon be under my control. Every person who depends on electricity will be subject to my will. The world will learn what the people of Milbrook learned 147 years ago, that there are forces beyond their understanding, and resistance is futile." I looked at the screen showing the expanding infection, the grid connections that were carrying Dr. Blackwood's consciousness across the continent like a virus. In trying to modernize the electrical infrastructure, we had created the perfect medium for his resurrection. "Join me willingly, David Morrison," the voice said, "and I will make you my lieutenant in the new world that is coming. Refuse, and you will simply be consumed like all the others." The temperature in the room was now so cold that ice was forming on the metal surfaces. My breath came in short, painful gasps, and I could feel my strength ebbing away. But I also felt something else, a stubborn spark of defiance that refused to be extinguished. "There's a third option," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Oh? And what would that be?" I looked at the main power coupling that connected the substation to the regional grid. It was a massive switch, designed to isolate the facility in case of emergency. If I could reach it, if I could cut the connection between Milbrook and the outside world. "You can't stop me by cutting the power," the voice said, reading my thoughts. "I am the power. I am every electron, every spark, every current that flows through these wires." "Maybe," I said, raising the wrench. "But you're also connected to the grid. And every connection can be severed." The last stand. I lunged toward the main power coupling, but the air around me seemed to thicken like liquid, making every movement incredibly difficult. The voice of Dr. Blackwood echoed through the room, no longer calm and measured but filled with rage. "You fool! You cannot comprehend what you are interfering with. I am eternal. I am inevitable." The electrical equipment around me began to spark and smoke as impossible amounts of current flowed through circuits that were never designed to handle such loads. The monitors exploded in showers of glass and flame, and the smell of burning insulation filled the air. But I kept moving toward the coupling. Each step was agony, as if I were walking through quicksand while carrying a tremendous weight. The wrench in my hand was growing hot, conducting the electromagnetic field that surrounded me like a living thing. "The people of this town were nothing," the voice raged. "Ignorant peasants who feared what they could not understand. But you, David Morrison, you are supposed to be a man of science. How can you side with ignorance against enlightenment?" I reached the coupling and raised the wrench above my head. The metal was now so hot it was burning my palm, but I held on. "Because," I gasped, "some things are more important than knowledge. Some doors should never be opened." The wrench came down on the coupling with all the force I could muster. There was a tremendous crack, like lightning striking directly overhead, and the lights went out. But this time, the darkness was different. It was clean, natural, the simple absence of light rather than the oppressive presence I had felt before. The humming stopped, the blue-white glow faded, and for the first time in hours, I could hear the normal sounds of the world outside: wind, the distant hum of traffic, the creak of settling buildings. I had done it. I had severed the connection between Milbrook and the regional grid, trapping Dr. Blackwood's consciousness in the local system and preventing it from spreading to the rest of the country. But as I stood in the darkness, catching my breath and trying to process what had just happened, I realized that my victory might be temporary. The voice was gone, but the presence remained, weaker now, but still there. I could feel it in the walls, in the very air around me. "You have won this battle, David Morrison," came a whisper, so faint I almost thought I had imagined it. "But I am patient. I have waited 147 years. I can wait longer." I stumbled toward the door, feeling my way in the darkness. The deadbolt turned easily now, and the door swung open to reveal the corridor beyond. Emergency lighting had activated, casting everything in a dim red glow that was somehow more reassuring than the supernatural illumination I had witnessed earlier. My car was where I had left it, and to my immense relief, it started on the first try. The digital clock on the dashboard showed 6:23 a.m., almost dawn. I had been in the control room for 8 hours, though it felt like a lifetime. As I drove through the empty streets of Milbrook, I could see the normal signs of a power outage: traffic lights dark, house windows black, the occasional emergency vehicle with its lights flashing. But there was no sign of the ghostly procession I had witnessed, no indication that anything supernatural had occurred. I stopped at the cemetery on my way out of town, driven by a morbid curiosity to see if there was any evidence of what I had experienced. The iron gates were closed and locked, just as they should be. The headstones stood in orderly rows, weathered but undisturbed. If hundreds of spirits had filed through here only hours before, They had left no trace of their passage. But in the oldest section of the cemetery, I found what I was looking for, a large monument with the inscription, Dr. Silas Blackwood, 1834-1876. Beloved physician and natural philosopher. He sought to harness the very forces of nature in service to mankind. Below the inscription, in smaller letters, was an addition that looked much newer: some knowledge comes at too high a price. I don't know who had added those words, or when. But as I stood there in the growing light of dawn, looking at the grave of the man who had nearly plunged the world into darkness, I knew they were true. The aftermath. I submitted my report to Commonwealth Edison 3 days later. It was a carefully crafted document that attributed the power fluctuations to a combination of aging infrastructure, unusual weather conditions, and harmonic resonance caused by the new smart meter installation. I recommended a complete overhaul of the electrical system and the installation of additional protective equipment. The report was accepted without question. The power company was happy to have a technical explanation for the problems, and the town council was pleased to receive funding for infrastructure improvements. Within 6 months, Milbrook had a completely new electrical grid, modern and efficient. But I kept the real report, the one that detailed everything I had experienced that night, locked in a safety deposit box, along with photographs of the data I had recorded and copies of the historical documents I had researched about Dr. Blackwood. Because I knew it wasn't over. The smart meters had been removed and replaced with conventional equipment, but the digital infrastructure of the modern world was still expanding, still creating new pathways for something like Dr. Blackwood's consciousness to exploit. Every new wireless network, every internet connection, every cell phone tower was a potential conduit. I started paying attention to the news differently after that. When I read about power outages in small towns, about electrical equipment malfunctioning in unusual patterns, about residents reporting strange phenomena during blackouts, I wondered if Dr. Blackwood had found a way to extend his influence despite my efforts. 3 months after the incident, I received a package at my home with no return address. Inside was a single photograph, a picture of the Milbrook cemetery taken at night, showing dozens of translucent figures standing among the headstones. And in the foreground, clear as day, was a man in a 19th century suit, looking directly at the camera with eyes that seemed to glow with their own internal light. On the back of the photograph, in spidery handwriting, was a simple message: "Thank you for the lesson in patience, David Morrison. The next time we meet, I will be ready." I've changed jobs since then. I no longer work on power grids or electrical infrastructure. I've moved to a small cabin in the Montana wilderness, where I generate my own power with solar panels and use as little electronic equipment as possible. I've convinced myself that isolation and simplicity are the keys to staying off Dr. Blackwood's radar. But every time there's a power outage, every time my generator fails or my solar panels don't produce enough juice, I find myself listening to the darkness, waiting for the sound of footsteps overhead or the tap of small fingers on glass. Because I know he's still out there, somewhere in the vast network of wires and circuits that connects our modern world. Waiting. Learning. Growing stronger. And I know that the next time the lights go out, he'll be ready for me. The scariest part? I think I'm ready for him too. Note: this account was found among the personal effects of David Morrison, former electrical engineer, who disappeared from his Montana cabin in March 2024. The cabin showed no signs of struggle, but neighbors reported seeing strange lights and hearing unusual sounds coming from the property on the night of his disappearance. The local power grid experienced significant fluctuations that same evening, and several residents reported their electronic devices displaying images of empty rooms and old-fashioned furniture. The investigation remains open. Hey everyone, thanks so much for listening. If you enjoyed the video, please hit that like and subscribe button, and then share with your friends. Your support helps us grow and create even more awesome content. We appreciate you being part of the journey. Here are a couple more videos for you to check out.